I think we have a question from next door that has arrived to ask it.
So I was just going to ask, it's a very powerful critique, but I'm interested to know, given that so many of the collective institutions that kind of helped us create a much fairer society have been eroded since Thatcherism, what you think what are the building blocks, where do we need to start to recreate that kind of collective sensibility and to roll back some of the sort of desolation of some of the communities that we've seen around, not Farnham particularly, but around the country?
That's a very good point. I think the Labour movement is still the biggest democratic movement in the country. It represents over 6 million wealth creators who keep this country ticking, who we all depend on. But I think it has to change in its nature because what's, in the 1950s, and what to glamorise that time, because these jobs that people did were backbreaking and dirty. They were dominated by men. But you had obviously communities based around mines and steelworks and factories in a way you don't have around supermarkets and call centres. I mean, as many people now work in call centres as work down the mines at the peak of the mining industry, and work is more transient. You used to have, again, very male-dominated work, so I'm not glamorising it, but people would often do the same job throughout the whole life, the same as their dad often, and people now often do lots of different jobs. So what the trade unions have to do is not just organise in the workplace, but organise on the community level as well. That means learning from youth community workers, and it means having a different approach. I mean, there's in the aftermath of the riots, which started in Tottenham in 2011, there's a guy I know, Simeon Brown, he's a youth community worker, and he got young people to come and play football and then talk about issues that affected them with local community leaders and politicians. Most people, of course, don't turn up to political meetings. They often have better things to do.
Communities are equally transient. I'm the only one of my family that still lives in London, for example, of a big family. We've got transient communities too as well.
It depends. I mean, about 70% of Britain live about 5 miles away from where they were born. So, but in places like London, that's certainly the case. You have often very transient populations. But even there you get, in London you have Citizens UK, which bring together often, obviously, people, faith-based communities, but others, to try and deal with the scourge of poverty. And that is often attracting, for example, migrant populations. You'll get trade unions, actually, for example, like the cleaners on the underground, who are often all recently arrived, or they're all migrants, and they're collectively organised as well. So you can get that. And there was a tradition in the 19th century of getting Irish migrants and the rest. They could often be the most organised and determined. So I do think you can get, there are precedents for that. I don't think you just have to be a settled population. Is it easy? No, but there are examples of it. Another example, I talked about tax justice in UK Uncut. That was young people coming together and occupying shops and businesses whose owners weren't paying their tax. They drove that issue on the agenda in quite a new and exciting way. They used social media to organise people, so they weren't giving out leaflets or pamphlets, as William Cobbett did back in his day. They used social media to get people to occupy those shops and businesses, and it had a success. So I think there are those movements that do exist. It's not easy, but we do, as I've said, actually in this country, back in the 19th century, it was often migrants and people from newly arrived people who could often be the most organised and dedicated, and that's still the case today. And I think of London Underground cleaners and other living wage campaigners in London. Often the people who've won the living wage are themselves cleaners from who've only recently arrived. So it is possible, even if it's not always that easy.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time we moved on to the next subject we want to look at, which is dear to the hearts of both our speakers, which is the press. And I know that Mr. Cobbett has some quite strong thoughts on the freedom of the press.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would be pleased to know from Mr. Jones the state of the press in your time. In my time, papers like the True Britain and the Standard were paid for with public money just to eulogise Pitt and his minions. Later, the Pilot and the Standard were established by the government to oppose my register. And I cannot refrain from mentioning the influence of newspapers, or the influence of advertisements in the newspapers. Let me read what I wrote again the second time I was thrown into Newgate, may I? The liberty of the press, I wrote, is a mere name and has no existence in reality, where any man cannot, without risk of harm to himself, publish the truth respecting the public character, conduct, and measures of men in public office. Some papers, the Morning Post in particular, are the property of companies, of traders, of speculators. The thing is regarded as a money-making speculation, and the most profitable policies will always be preferred. In all the daily papers, paragraphs from individuals or bodies of men are inserted for payment. The price is enormous, not less than a guinea an inch. Of course, the rich villain has the whole of the daily press for his defender or apologist, while the oppressed or slandered man, if he be poor, has no means whatever of appealing to the justice of the public. Well, Mr. Jones, what think you of that, and have things changed?
Have things changed, Mr.
Have things
Jones?
changed? Well, first, of course, you were persecuted in your day for standing up for freedom of expression. I think you should give him a round of applause. Just so... He's a martyr in the struggle. Look, we're told we have a free press in this country, and that's true in the sense the government doesn't control the press. We're not North Korea, not a very ambitious place to start, to be honest with you. But I don't want to belittle that point, because in other countries, journalists are persecuted, imprisoned, as he was in his day, tortured and murdered. So there does need to be a bit of perspective. However, in this country, much of the press, most of the press, is run by a very, very small group of very rich media moguls who are part of a status quo, of course, it's in their interest to defend. Rather than being a source of, the means of information, a pillar of democracy that exists to scrutinise the powerful, it's an instrument of the powerful. It's a means, if you monopolise the means of information, that gives you a huge amount of political influence, which is wielded very effectively, of course, by those with power. Now, before I go on to what that means in practice, that can become a crutch for people like me. And the danger is, by what I mean is, we just go, well, the reason we haven't succeeded, it's the press, they go around brainwashing everyone, and that's a very patronising way of looking at people. If you just reduce them to robots or sheep, it's not only patronising, it's also defeatist, because if you believe that, then there's no hope. If people are so easily brainwashed, and I think if we had an inspiring alternative, backed up by a movement that can reach people, then we would be able to overcome that influence. It needs a sophisticated strategy to deal with. But in any case, as well as the fact the media is dominated by the press is by such a small group of people, what you've got is journalists are unrepresentative of a country, of a society that they exist to serve. And there's lots of different reasons for that. One is hard to deal with, if you like. It's the decline of local newspapers, which has been happening for a very long time. And local newspapers were often a means of training up aspiring working class journalists. Again, without being roasted into about an era in which I wasn't there, but people could leave school at the age of 16, make tea at the local newspaper and climb the ranks. And some of the older political journalists, that's how they started. They didn't actually go to university at all. But there were two other, I think, more pernicious and more easy to solve problems as well. One is the rise of the unpaid internship, where you're expected often in my profession to work for free for months, if not longer, and you need to do that in order to get it on your CV to hope to get a job of any description at the end of it. There's no guarantee of a job at the end of that either. Now, often that's in London, which is one of the most expensive cities on the face of the earth. And if you have parents with the financial means, then perhaps you can afford to do that, but most people can't. So we end up discriminating on the basis not of people's ability, but on the basis of people's wealth, or their parents' wealth. The same with the rise of postgraduate qualifications, which are ever more essential to get a job in the media, postgraduate qualifications in journalism. Very expensive, thousands of pounds in fees, plus living costs. Most people can't afford to do that. So according to the government's own research, over half of the top 100 journalists are privately educated, but only 7% of people in Britain go to private schools. 14 or 15% or so of those top journalists went to a comprehensive. 90% of us go to comprehensive schools in Britain. So they're completely unrepresentative of modern Britain. And the other point is, because of, I think, cumulative impact of ownership and the sorts of people working there, is partly the if you like, the spreading of myths, and again, people have agency. I'm not just saying people are brainwashed, but in modern Britain, people think on average benefit fraud is 27% of spending on social security. According to the government's own figures, it's only 0.7%. People think benefits are far higher, that they go to people, they don't know which people they go to, because over half, rightly, of the welfare state goes to pensioners. People think there are 20 times more teenage pregnancies than there are. They think immigration is much higher than it is, that there are far many people, far more British Muslims than there actually are. And that is partly because of a media that doesn't challenge myths, that doesn't challenge prejudice, but instead fans prejudice and division, that spreads, if you like, misinformation to say the least, and focuses on extreme examples of people often at the bottom of society and portrays them as the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's wrong. I think we should have a free press that genuinely challenges the powerful, that challenges myths, even if that's unpopular to do so, that speaks truth to power. We don't have that press, but my word, that is a press we should aspire to.
Thank goodness you didn't mention the Daily Mail.
There's still time.